So I'm going to talk a little bit about a research effort that's been underway as a collaborative effort between Roger Williams as well as the Community Partnership Center that we have on campus, Grow Smart and Housing Works. And this started, as John mentioned, back in about January. And it was really started as an interest when John approached me talking about the future transit master plan development, and I had real interest in getting my students some real-world planning experience. So it really was a nice kind of a collaborative element that began back in January. And I should mention too that this effort really has many great people. I should almost mention all their names because they're just so wonderful in contributing to this effort. But Annette Bourne, Brenda Clement, Peter Braza, Roger Leaf, John, and Scott are all major contributors to this TOD working group, as we kind of call ourselves. And so essentially how this started was thinking about how my coursework that I teach at Roger Williams, which are urban planning courses, new to Roger Williams, actually the courses are, and we hope to expand them, could really support some of these planning efforts that are happening across the state. So the two classes I'm talking about are a Gis Spatial Analysis class that happened last spring, and then the current right now I'm teaching an introduction to urban and regional planning. Both classes have about 40 students in them. They're majority graduate students, and they range from architecture, historic preservation, or even environmental science disciplines. So they're coming from a variety of backgrounds. And the project really had a set of objectives to get us started. First, we wanted to identify where TOD opportunities in the state of Rhode Island could exist. We wanted to research and investigate the local assets and challenges of potential sites within Rhode Island. And then ultimately develop local and state interest in these types of communities that support obviously walkable, compact, transit-rich communities with diverse and attainable housing. So to add to our discussion of what TOD is, I think really a large focus here is thinking about housing, thinking about how we can create and generate much more attainable housing in the state, but also to really support larger sustainable efforts. So thinking about TOD as a way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, as a way to benefit people with public health, and increase their walking. And so there's a lot of, and also preserving our agricultural lands and forest lands. So I think there's a lot of environmental benefits to thinking about very compact development. But we know that there's a series of challenges facing us. One, Rhode Island is an automobile culture. Two, there's usually insufficient rail speed, frequency, and ridership along our rail line, which has been challenging. Also, transit infrastructure, such as these train stations, are often outside of service boundaries, which means there's a challenge to get water and sewer and basic services there for the development of denser housing. And then statewide bus services are covering the vast distances. I think Greg told me once RIP does either one of two or three statewide transit systems across the nation. So they're stretched, and they have to travel from Woonsocket all the way down to Westerly. So there's quite a scope that they're dealing with. And so two research questions guided us. The first semester with the GIS course, it was where are these potential locations for TOD in Rhode Island? And then the second question is what are those future TOD scenarios for particular locations? So that was the second question was addressed currently right now this semester. The methodology that the students have looked at throughout the two semesters, certainly the GIS analysis, looking at different multivariate analysis, suitability analysis, traditional case studies, looking at other local, regional, national TOD precedents, gathering information from those. They also looked at a handful of municipal plans and policies of the 5 municipalities to really vet them and look to see where there's already grounding in their goals and objectives towards TOD types of development. So what do they already have in place or are thinking about? And then last, a more specific site deep dive at about a half mile and then also a mile radius, both looking at what's there now, their existing conditions, but also what the future development could become. So with all of these different methods, I'll just go through a series of kind of examples of what we're looking at, what we're finding, what they're analyzing. With the GIS course, there's really two ways that we thought about where TOD could potentially happen. One half of the students wanted to look at communities that really had a need for more transit. So on the left there, what you have is at the block group level, you have senior communities, or where elderly live, and their relationship to the bus lines. So trying to detect where communities might need more service. Also here on the right, we have a map developed that shows where the lowest income residents are and those residents with the farthest or the longest commute times. So here again, we have a case where those might be most susceptible or most in need of a particular robust transit system. So there's one dimension to look at this through the vulnerable community lens, but there's the other lens that kind of what Greg's been talking a bit about, where's the density already existing that could serve robust transit. So here on the right, we have a map of where the population, where the density of housing is already located and where that might be most able to support new change to a particular location and increase of density. On the left, you have a map that shows Rhode Island's existing sewered areas overlaid with both its inactive and active rail systems to give you a sense of where it is that we have infrastructure in place to begin to think about denser housing. So on the other side, these are places that you might qualify as more ready in terms of TOD development. And we went through almost, there's this whole series of maps, and we've got a whole series of findings naming and identifying specific communities that do meet each of these different elements. So what the takeaways for the GIS was looking at, first, a majority of these vulnerable communities are limited to bus transit, and the bus system has remnants or origins of a hub-spoke network that we saw earlier being talked about, which makes it very difficult for some of these communities to get places fast, efficiently. Second, many communities with significant population or housing and jobs actually have somewhat of a minimal relationship to the actual rail stations or the rail infrastructure of the state. So for instance, Wickford Junction, Kingston Station, they certainly are kind of disconnected in a sense from where the existing population lives. And then we have concluding, with this, we do believe the students did really argue for that TOD can exist both in places that are town centers, such as Woonsocket or Westerly, but they can also exist in very suburban or more rural areas, such as the Kingston Station or the Wickford Junction. So we're really putting all areas in Rhode Island on the table when we think about this. You can read up a little bit on the GIS methodology that was published in the American Planning Association magazine this past summer, if you're interested. And this was just a review of looking at all the case studies. So this is one example. We did look at City Center Warwick as one case study and really dissecting them for three elements: land use, their transportation, and their housing. So there's a whole series of these different case studies we've investigated and helped really the students set them up for this deep dive. So after the GIS analysis, we looked at quite a bit of the data. We had a lot of team discussions and thinking about which locations we could choose to actually investigate more deeply. I had about 20 students, so I could get about 5 locations to investigate. And we chose this set at the end of the day, and each area is being investigated within a half-mile radius surrounding it. So Woonsocket Station, Wickford Junction, Kingston Station, Westerly, and those are all realized as rail transportation types of TOD. The bus transportation type of TOD that we looked at was north end in Newport. So I'm going to take you through just a couple, just to give you a feel for, I can't quite do them all, of course, but we really began with bringing the municipal planners into the classroom. So all 5 municipalities had planners meet with the students for a few hours on a particular evening. I always joke this was really the shocking time for my students. They had big visions until they realized the realities on the ground. But they found this a truly meaningful experience to actually sit there and learn from planners directly about those particular issues. One of the beginning parts was to look at the social and economic profile of each particular area. They used Esri's business analyst and actually got data down to the half mile using census data. For instance, Wickford Junction, we've got this case where there's actually a very high household incomes. We have very low population. We have very high number of employees in the area. So there's a lot of very interesting kind of background demographics that shape each condition. Over in the existing infrastructure, we looked at things such as how many bus stops, how many bus lines are coming through particular areas, what is the frequency of the rail at these locations, is there any bike network connected to it, what is the condition of the sidewalk. So really thinking about what that infrastructure we have in place at each particular location. From there, they moved into development conditions. So these really, they began to scope and look at how much support is there in that municipality for thinking about new development, or is there any resistance to that? Where is the vacant or the underused land, but also the vacant building stock? So they've gone through and quantified various square footages and acreages of each of those conditions, and they're beginning to kind of deep dive into those. The third initial existing condition was desirability. What makes this place attractive? How walkable is it? Where are the cultural resources? Where are the parks, the schools, the hospitals that really make this place something that you can live and work within? So, and then you can see on that far left is where the students were going through each municipality's plans and policies and really vetting them for their goals and objectives towards this effort. To synthesize all that information, they made these fancy charts, but they're really just quantifying and think about how ready is this location for TOD. Wickford Junction came in at a relatively low score, given its lack of particular elements. So it did have a long range, but you might find something like Westerly, which was actually came through in more of an emerging category. And so I believe Woonsocket might also be the area that also came through as an emerging element as well, and Newport actually. So this really kind of helped them make sense of all the background information and synthesize it into a question of how ready are we. So, and they also highlighted for each location a series of assets and challenges. So for example, for this Wickford Junction location, certainly one of the assets is we have rail infrastructure there on the ground. That is definitely something that's really beneficial. It has ample parking. It has ample acreage for development. It has some commercial retail, typically mostly regional kind of commercial retail, so it is bringing people in regionally. The challenges are obvious that there's no sewer, so that's going to be really difficult to develop densely. Infrequent service, limited sidewalk or biking infrastructure, a very low density residential stock. So they're really going through and kind of compiling what are the good and the bad for each location as we think about this. And so what they're doing now, and I wish I had some more product to show you of it, but this is giving you a sense of what they're doing is they're now in the proposal phase. So they've went through the existing conditions, now they're thinking forward about this. And on the top left there, they're going to develop an opportunities map. So they will suggest rezonings. They will suggest perhaps new forms of transportation. They will suggest new densities of development in those opportunity maps. They'll also create a visual to get you to think about what that density actually looks like at the end of the day. Oftentimes we hear the word, but when we see it, it's actually not so bad. So they're really going to think about three-dimensionally modeling some of these portions to give a better sense of what that means. And then they're also calculating and thinking about where is that vacant land, and how, if we projected forward, how might 20 units per acre actually map out? How many housing units is that? And does that match the amount of developable land that we have at those particular sites? So they're also beginning to kind of quantify both housing and employment density, business density, and thinking about that availability of the land. So I wish I had more kind of solutions here, but it's giving you a sense of where we're heading right now in the classroom. So, and just by comparison, to look at another location, Woonsocket, very different context than Wickford Junction. We have a much lower income in this area, but we have a very high population density. Much like Warren, it has lots of locations for infill development, and it also has infrastructure there for a rail system, in the hopes that it would be be developed out fully in the future. You can certainly pull out some key assets of Woonsocket. The idea of there being a lot of vacant buildings for development could actually be conceptualized as an asset. The expected commuter rail service, a central business district. It already has kind of the natural qualities of what a TOD location could have. But the challenges, their community support isn't quite as strong as, say, Westerly, for instance. It has some elements of unattractiveness, but it certainly, and it also kind of lacks investment in those particular areas. Narrow streets, so it's also difficult for the buses to navigate quite a bit of Woonsocket because the terrain is so varied. So every place, as we mentioned, is a very unique case, but what we're hoping to do is the students by the end will really start to think forward about recommendations for each of these municipalities. And this is, the students are crafting these now. These are some that have been drafted and thought about through the TOD working group. But to give you some examples, thinking about adopting a municipal TOD district vision plan, really concretizing this question of how we might change our zoning and reduce our parking in particular locations. Participate in RIPTA Transit Master Plan and optimize transit service for the TOD district. Reform zoning to accommodate higher densities. And then a couple more, reform parking requirements for districts, as well as identify these vacant lands and actually saving and preserving them for the future potential growth that we might encounter. So the students are crafting a series of these now specific to each location and really going to put forward a set of ideas for the future of this. They should be done in a few weeks, but the report will probably be wrapped up about mid-January, and we hope to share it with both local and state planners to hopefully influence and help support a lot of the transportation master planning underway. So, thank you.
Thank you.